The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet town, painting everything in soft gold. Dust swirled through the air as a stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the general store. From it stepped a young woman, clutching a small brown suitcase like it was all she had left in the world. Her name was Clara. She stood still for a moment, her eyes scanning the long stretch of road, the faded buildings, and the few curious faces peeking through windows. The air was dry and heavy with silence, except for the creak of the coach wheels moving away. She was alone now. Her dress, though carefully pressed, was worn at the edges. Her hair was tied neatly, but strands kept falling over her face with the wind. She brushed them back and looked around, trying to spot the man she was promised to. The man who had written to her, the rancher who said he needed a wife. She had imagined this moment so many times during the long journey west. But now that she was here, her hands trembled. A few men leaned against the railing by the saloon, whispering among themselves. One laughed under his breath. Clara didn't have to hear the words to know they were about her. The same words she had heard her whole life, the ones that stuck like thorns in her chest. Too round, too plain, no man wants a fat bride. She kept her eyes forward, her chin high, pretending their laughter didn't matter. Inside it did, it always did. She took a small breath and whispered to herself, I can cook, I can clean, I can work hard. That was the one thing she held on to, her worth, wrapped tightly in her ability to make a home, even if she never felt beautiful enough to belong in one. The sound of hoofbeats broke her thoughts. A tall man rode in from the dirt road, stopping in front of her. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. His shirt was dusty, his vest worn, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. Clara knew instantly this was him, the rancher. For a moment neither spoke. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. She stood still, clutching her suitcase, heart pounding. Finally, he tipped his hat and said in a quiet, steady voice, You must be Clara. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The man before her, Eli, was taller than she expected, his shoulders broad and his hands rough from work. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but his voice carried a calm weight that made her heart skip. He didn't smile. He didn't frown either. Just studied her quietly like he was trying to see who she was beyond the dust and fear. Long ride? He asked finally, his tone even. Yes, sir, she answered softly. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. He nodded once, then glanced at her small suitcase. That all you got? It's enough, she said, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. He picked up the suitcase without another word and turned toward the waiting wagon. The horses stood still, their tails flicking lazily at the flies. Clara hesitated before following him, her boots sinking into the dirt. The sun was climbing higher now, and sweat trickled down her back beneath the heavy fabric of her dress. When he helped her climb onto the wagon, his hand brushed hers for just a second, calloused, warm, steady. She looked up at him, hoping to find some trace of kindness in his eyes, but he was already turning away, tying the reins and guiding the horses forward. The wagon jolted as it began to move. They rode in silence for a while, the sound of hooves and wheels filling the space between them. Clara looked out across the open land, the fields stretching as far as she could see. The sky seemed endless, beautiful but lonely. She tried to speak a few times, to say something polite, something that might ease the awkward quiet, but her courage failed her each time. After a long stretch, Eli finally broke the silence. You ever been out this far west before? She shook her head. No, sir, I grew up in Kansas City. Lot of noise there, I reckon. Yes, she said. Too much sometimes. He grunted in agreement but said nothing more. Clara studied him out of the corner of her eye. He had that quiet sort of strength, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was something steady about him, like he belonged to the land. She wondered if he saw her the same way, or if she looked as out of place as she felt. After a while, the town disappeared behind them. The road turned rough and the wheels bumped over dry ruts. Clara held tightly to the seat to keep from falling. Dust clung to her dress and face, and her throat ached from the dry air. "Sorry for the road," Eli said without looking at her. "It's all right," she murmured. "I've had worse." He glanced at her then, the faintest trace of curiosity in his eyes. "You sound like someone who's seen plenty." Clara hesitated. "Maybe more than I wanted to." He didn't ask what she meant, and she was grateful for that. Some stories weren't ready to be told, especially to a man you just met. The ranch came into view near sundown. It was smaller than she expected but well kept. A wooden house with a wraparound porch, a barn, and a few outbuildings. The fields behind stretched toward the horizon, glowing gold in the fading light. It wasn't grand, but it was alive. Smoke curled from the chimney and the sound of animals carried on the breeze. "This'll be your home now," Eli said as the wagon stopped. Clara nodded, staring at the house. For a moment she felt something strange, hope maybe. A flicker of belonging she hadn't felt in years. She climbed down carefully, her boots landing on solid ground. Eli carried her suitcase up the porch steps and opened the front door. "Go on in," he said. Inside, the house smelled of pine and faint smoke. The floors were clean, the furniture simple but sturdy. A stone fireplace stood at the center of the room, half-burned logs still glowing faintly. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, like a place meant for living, not just surviving. "You can take the room down the hall," he said, pointing. "It's been empty a while." She looked around, unsure what to say. "It's nice," she offered. He nodded once. "Supper'll be soon. I'll feed the horses." When he stepped back outside, the silence in the house pressed in around her. She placed her suitcase on the small bed in her new room and sat down slowly. The bed creaked beneath her weight. She ran her hand over the quilt, a simple patchwork of faded blues and browns, and wondered who had sewn it. Maybe his mother, maybe no one at all. She took a deep breath, staring at her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. The face that stared back was tired, her cheeks flushed from the heat and dust. Her hair had come loose again, curling around her neck. She didn't look like the women in magazines or the ones who turned heads at dances. She looked like a woman who had worked, who had carried too many disappointments and still found the courage to try again. Her stomach tightened as she thought about the rancher outside, the man she had come here to marry. Would he ever see her as more than the woman who arrived out of a desperate arrangement? She couldn't be sure, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't let shame define her again. When Eli returned, she was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, preparing supper. He paused in the doorway, surprised. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said. She smiled faintly without turning. "I like to cook. It helps me think." He lingered for a moment, watching her knead the dough with practiced hands. The smell of bread already filled the air. There was a steadiness in her movements that made something in him ease. "All right then," he said finally. "Don't let me stop you." By the time the bread was done, the light outside had dimmed to gold. They ate quietly by the fire, the crackling wood the only sound between them. Clara kept her eyes on her plate, too nervous to meet his gaze. Eli, on the other hand, found himself glancing at her more than once, not because of her size, but because of the calm way she carried herself, even in silence. When they finished, she gathered the dishes and began to wash them. He watched her for a moment, then stood. "You've had a long day," he said. "Get some rest." She nodded, drying her hands on her apron. "Good night, Mr. Eli." He paused, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. "Just Eli," he corrected. She smiled softly. "Good night, Eli." He tipped his hat and left her standing there in the warm glow of the fire. And though not a single promise had been spoken between them, something small, something wordless, had begun to take root in the quiet of that house. The morning light crept through the cracks in the curtains, brushing across the wooden floor like gold. Clara woke early, the way she always did, her body trained by years of work. The house was silent except for the faint creak of boards under her feet and the soft hum of the wind outside. She slipped on her apron, tied her hair back, and went straight to the kitchen. The smell of coffee soon filled the air, rich and comforting. She baked biscuits and fried eggs, arranging everything neatly on the table. By the time Eli came in from the barn, his boots tracking dust, breakfast was waiting. He stopped at the doorway, glancing at the food, then at her. "You didn't have to do all that," he said quietly. She smiled, though her hands fidgeted with the edge of her apron. "I like to keep busy." He nodded, sitting down. The scrape of his chair sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. Clara poured his coffee and then sat opposite him, trying to eat but too aware of every sound: the clink of the fork, the rustle of his sleeve, the rhythm of his breathing. Eli didn't say much while he ate. He never did. But when he finished, he looked up briefly. "Best biscuits I've had in years." Her heart stuttered. "Thank you," she said softly. It wasn't much, just a few words, but they carried a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. After he left to tend to the fields, Clara cleaned the kitchen and stepped outside. The sun was already high, and the air smelled of hay and dust. She walked along the fence, studying the land. It stretched endlessly, dotted with cattle and wildflowers, framed by a sky so big it made her feel both small and alive. She'd never known silence like this, not the kind that came from emptiness, but the kind that breathed. She spent the day working, scrubbing floors, washing linens, mending clothes. Every corner of the house bore signs of a man who lived alone for too long. She wanted to fix that, not for gratitude or reward, but because it felt good to create order, to bring warmth into spaces that had forgotten what it felt like. When the sun began to sink, Eli returned. He smelled of leather and dirt and sweat, his shirt clinging to him. He looked exhausted, but when he saw the freshly cleaned porch and the flowers she'd placed in a chipped jar by the window, he stopped short. "You've been busy," he said, almost like a question. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "I didn't want to sit idle." He gave a small nod. "It looks nice." That night they ate together again, stew this time, thick and savory. The quiet between them wasn't as heavy as before. When he asked if she liked living out here, she hesitated, searching for the truth. "It's quiet," she said finally, "but I think I could learn to like it." He looked at her across the table. "Quiet's good, gives you time to think." She smiled faintly. "I've done enough thinking for a lifetime." He didn't press. That was something she appreciated about Eli. He didn't pry. He gave her space, though sometimes that space felt like a canyon between them. Days turned into a rhythm. Eli worked from dawn until dusk, and Clara filled her hours with the small, steady chores that shaped a home, tending the garden, baking, sewing, even reading by the fire when she could find a moment to rest. The more she settled into the routine, the less she flinched when the ranch hands came by. At first, they'd been loud, curious, and a little cruel. She'd heard their whispers when they thought she couldn't. "That's the bride. She's a big one." Rancher must have been real desperate. The words stung, but she never showed it. She greeted them kindly, served them fresh bread, and kept her voice calm. Over time, their laughter quieted. The jokes stopped. They still watched her, but now with something closer to respect. One afternoon, as she was pulling loaves from the oven, Eli walked in. The smell hit him immediately, warm bread and cinnamon. He paused in the doorway, breathing it in. "You've got the whole house smelling like heaven," he said. Clara looked up, surprised by the softness in his tone. "I hope you're hungry." "I'm always hungry," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For the first time she laughed. A small sound, but it caught him off guard. He hadn't realized how much he wanted to hear her laugh until that moment. Over the next few weeks, something began to shift between them. It wasn't spoken. It wasn't planned. It was in the small things, the way she poured his coffee before he asked, the way he brought her wildflowers from the field without saying a word. One evening, as the sky turned red with sunset, she sat on the porch sewing a tear in her dress. Eli joined her, lowering himself onto the step beside her. The silence between them was easy now, the kind that didn't need to be filled. "You work harder than most men I know," he said quietly. She smiled without looking up. "I've had to." "Why's that?" She hesitated, needle pausing mid-stitch. "People don't give much to women like me. I learned to earn my place." Eli frowned slightly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "People talk too much." "Don't mean they're right." Clara's throat tightened. "Maybe, but words stick, even when you don't want them to." He turned to her then, his gaze steady. Then maybe they just ain't met the right man to prove them wrong. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The words caught her completely off guard, not just because they were kind, but because they sounded like truth. The air grew cooler as night fell, and the stars began to show one by one. Eli stood after a while, tipping his hat. "Don't stay up too late," he said softly. "I won't." He lingered a moment longer before heading inside, his boots thudding lightly on the porch. Clara sat still, staring at the empty chair beside her. The sound of crickets filled the air. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Inside, the house was warm with the smell of bread and firewood. For the first time since she arrived, she felt something close to peace, not because she belonged, but because she might one day. The thought scared her as much as it soothed her. She had come expecting indifference, maybe even pity. But now there was something else taking root, slow, quiet, and uncertain, like a seed waiting for rain. The next morning began like every other, yet somehow it felt different. The sky was clear and wide, the kind of blue that seemed to go on forever. Clara stood on the porch with her apron tied tight, a strand of hair slipping loose as the breeze brushed against her face. Eli was already in the barn, the sound of his hammer striking rhythmically against wood. She could hear the horses snorting, restless for their morning feed. Life on the ranch moved with its own steady rhythm, quiet but alive. Clara carried a basket of biscuits and coffee to the barn. Eli didn't notice her at first, too focused on repairing a fence post near the corral. When he finally looked up, his brow glistened with sweat. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice deep but softer now. She smiled faintly. "I know, but I figured you'd forget to eat if I didn't bring it." That made him pause, then nod. "You might be right." He took the biscuit, and for a moment their eyes met. It was only a few seconds, but something about it stayed with her, the steadiness in his gaze, the unspoken appreciation there. No pity, no judgment, just a quiet understanding that said more than words could. The days grew warmer, and the air was heavy with the scent of wildflowers. Clara found herself settling into life on the ranch, her hands roughening from work but her spirit feeling strangely lighter. She cooked, cleaned, and tended the small garden behind the house. At night, she'd sit by the fire with a cup of tea, listening to the crickets outside while Eli repaired tools or mended leather straps beside her. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was comfortable, like a shared language neither had to explain. One afternoon, Clara decided to fix the old chicken coop behind the barn. The boards were loose and the latch barely held. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sun beat down on her shoulders, but she didn't stop. Eli came around the corner hours later, surprised to see her hammering a nail into place. "What on earth are you doing?" he asked, amusement flickering across his face. "Trying to keep your chickens from escaping," she said, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "They've been wandering farther every day." He leaned against the fence, crossing his arms. "You could have asked for help." She looked up at him with a hint of mischief. "You'd have told me no." That made him laugh, a real laugh, deep and unguarded. It startled her, but it warmed her too. She couldn't remember the last time a man had laughed with her, not at her. He stepped closer, taking the hammer gently from her hand. "Let me finish it," he said. "You've done enough." Clara hesitated, wanting to protest, but she saw something in his eyes, something protective, maybe even proud. She stepped back and watched as he drove the last few nails in with practiced ease. When he finished, he turned to her and said quietly, "You've got grit, Clara. Most folks would have quit halfway." She shrugged, though her chest tightened at the praise. "I've had to work for everything in my life. Quitting never did much good." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, almost to himself, he said, "Reckon I know that feeling." From that day, things between them shifted even more. Eli started talking more small things at first, stories about the ranch, his horses, the storms that used to flood the fields. Clara listened, soaking up every word. In return, she told him about the city she came from, the noise, the crowded streets, The way people looked right through her like she was invisible. "You ain't invisible here," Eli said one evening as they sat on the porch, the sky painted pink and orange. She looked at him, unsure how to respond. "I don't think anyone's ever said that to me." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low. Then they were blind. For a long moment the world seemed to still. The only sound was the wind moving through the grass, the soft creak of the rocking chair beneath them. Clara wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered as it always did. Still, something about the way he said it, the quiet conviction, made her chest ache. A few days later, a summer storm rolled in. The sky turned dark, thunder echoing across the hills. Eli rushed to bring the horses into the barn, and Clara ran to help, her skirt soaked by the rain. The lightning cracked overhead, and one of the horses reared, frightened by the noise. Clara moved quickly, trying to calm it, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Clara, get back!" Eli shouted, but she stood her ground, speaking softly to the horse until it settled. When it finally calmed, she turned to find him staring at her, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You could have been hurt," he said, his voice sharp but trembling slightly. "I'm fine," she replied, catching her breath. "You needed help." He stepped closer, his eyes fierce. "You scared the life out of me." The storm raged around them, wind whipping through the barn, but neither moved. She met his gaze squarely. "I told you I don't scare easy." That made him go quiet. Then after a moment his tone softened. "No, I guess you don't." When the storm finally passed, they stood together at the barn door, watching the rain fade into mist. The fields shimmered under the pale light of the setting sun, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Clara's hands were trembling now, though not from fear. Eli glanced down, noticing, and for a brief second he reached out as if to take her hand, but stopped himself. The moment passed, but it lingered like a whisper between them. The next morning the world smelled clean again, the sky washed new. Clara brewed coffee and set 2 cups on the porch table. When Eli joined her, she didn't say a word. She just poured his cup and sat beside him. He took a sip, eyes on the horizon. "You ever get tired of proving yourself?" She smiled softly. "Every day, but stopping doesn't change the way people see you." Eli looked at her then, long and steady. "Maybe you don't have to change what they see. Maybe you just remind them what they're missing." Clara didn't answer, but something in her shifted, a small, fragile piece of her that had been hidden away for years. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The fire started just after dusk. It began as a flicker in the barn, a faint orange glow that could have been mistaken for lamplight. But within minutes, smoke curled into the sky, thick and dark. Clara was in the kitchen when she smelled it, sharp, bitter, wrong. She dropped the wooden spoon she was holding and ran outside, her heart slamming against her ribs. The sight froze her in place. Flames licked at the edges of the barn roof, spreading fast, fueled by the dry summer air. "Eli!" she screamed, her voice raw. He was already there, running toward the blaze with a bucket in each hand. "Stay back!" he shouted, but Clara didn't listen. She grabbed another bucket from the porch, filling it at the pump, her fingers trembling. The water splashed over her arms as she ran, but she didn't stop. The air was thick with heat, each breath burning in her throat. By the time she reached the barn, the sound of crackling wood drowned out everything else. The horses were panicking inside, their cries piercing through the roar of the fire. Eli had one arm over his face, trying to reach the stalls. Clara could see him coughing, struggling against the smoke. Without thinking, she rushed in after him. The world inside the barn was chaos. Sparks flew like angry fireflies. The heat was unbearable, the air choking. She could barely see, barely think, but instinct drove her forward. She grabbed a rope, fumbling with the latch of the nearest stall. A frightened mare reared, nearly knocking her over. "Easy, girl," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Easy." She pulled the rope free and slapped the horse's flank, sending it bolting toward the open door. Eli turned just in time to see her through the haze, his face twisted in anger and fear. "Clara, get out." "Not yet," she shouted back, pulling open another stall. Her hands burned where the rope cut into her skin. Smoke clawed at her lungs, making her eyes water. She didn't know how many she'd freed, 2, maybe 3, but she couldn't stop. Eli caught her arm, dragging her toward the door. "You're done," he said through gritted teeth. "You hear me?" "You're done," she tried to protest, but her voice gave out in a cough. He didn't wait for her to argue. With one strong pull, he hauled her into the open air. They stumbled into the dirt, both gasping. Behind them, the barn's roof groaned, then collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Clara lay there, her lungs burning, her hands raw and blistered. Eli knelt beside her, his chest heaving. "You could have died," he said, his voice rough. She turned her head toward him, her face streaked with soot. "So could you?" He stared at her, speechless for a moment. Then he laughed, a small, shaky sound that didn't match the chaos around them. "You're out of your damn mind," he said softly. "Maybe," she whispered, "but I wasn't about to let your horses die." The wind carried the smell of smoke across the field. Ranch hands ran past them, shouting orders, trying to douse what was left of the fire. The flames had calmed, but the barn was ruined. The once strong wooden beams were nothing but blackened skeletons against the stars. Eli looked at the wreckage, then back at Clara. Her dress was torn, her hands bleeding, but there was something fierce in her eyes, something that made his chest tighten. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're hurt." "I've been worse," she said, though her voice trembled. "Come inside," he said firmly. "Now." He helped her to her feet, his arms steady around her waist as they walked back to the house. Inside, the light from the fire still flickered through the window, casting long shadows across the walls. Eli guided her to the kitchen table, his jaw tight as he fetched a basin of water. Clara watched him move, silent, her mind still reeling. He knelt in front of her, gently taking her hands in his. When the cool water touched her burns, she winced, but didn't pull away. Eli worked carefully, his rough fingers trembling slightly. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said quietly. "I couldn't just stand and watch." He looked up at her then, and their eyes locked. The anger in his expression softened into something else, something deeper. "You scared me half to death," he admitted. "Thought I was about to lose you." Clara's breath caught. "You wouldn't have missed me long," he frowned. "Don't say that." "It's true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not the kind of woman men miss. Not the kind they—" Eli stopped her with a shake of his head. "Don't finish that sentence." He sat back slightly, his gaze steady. "You're wrong." Her lips parted, but no sound came. He leaned forward, his voice low but sure. "You think people don't see you. You think they look past you. But I've been watching since the day you stepped off that stagecoach. You work harder than anyone I've met. You care about every living thing on this land. And you make it feel like home again." Clara blinked rapidly, her eyes stinging, not from smoke this time, but from tears she couldn't hold back. "You don't have to say that," she murmured. "I ain't saying it because I have to," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true." The room was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Eli wrapped her hands in clean cloth, his movements slow, careful. When he finished, he didn't pull away right away. His thumb brushed the back of her hand, tracing the edge of the bandage. "You're something else, Clara," he said softly. "I've met plenty of strong folks in my time, but none like you." Her heart fluttered unsteady. "You don't mean that." "I do." She looked down at their joined hands, unsure what to do with the warmth rising in her chest. The air between them felt charged, like the quiet after a storm, fragile but full of promise. Outside, the last of the smoke faded into the night sky. Inside, Eli stayed by her side until her eyes grew heavy, exhaustion finally pulling her toward sleep. As her head tilted forward, he caught it gently, guiding her to rest against his shoulder. For a long time, he didn't move. He just sat there, feeling the weight of her head against him, the rhythm of her breathing, the steady thud of his own heart in return. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The barn could be rebuilt, the land could recover, but he knew one thing with certainty. This woman, the one who'd run into fire without hesitation, wasn't just another name on a paper. She was everything he hadn't known he was missing. The morning after the fire was quiet, almost too quiet. The air still carried a faint scent of smoke, and the ground was damp from the night dew. Clara woke to find her hands wrapped neatly in clean bandages. Her arms ached, her body sore, but it wasn't the pain that startled her. It was the empty chair beside her bed. Eli wasn't there. She sat up slowly, the wooden floor cool against her bare feet. Through the open window she could see him outside, near what was left of the barn. He was standing alone, hat in hand, staring at the wreckage. The sunlight touched his shoulders, turning the dust around him into gold. For a long moment Clara just watched. There was something about the way he stood, still, yet heavy with thought, that pulled at her. When she finally stepped outside, he turned, surprised. "You shouldn't be up," he said, his voice low but gentle. "I can walk," she answered, pulling her shawl tighter around her. "And I can't stay in bed while you're out here doing everything alone." He looked like he wanted to argue, but then he sighed and nodded. "You're stubborn." She smiled faintly. "So are you." They stood side by side, staring at the ashes where the barn had been. The wind picked up, carrying a few blackened feathers across the field. One of the surviving horses whinnied softly from the paddock, as if sensing their mood. "I'll rebuild it," Eli said after a while. "Might take weeks, maybe more, but I'll get it done." Clara looked up at him. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll help." His brow furrowed. "You've already done more than most would." "I want to," she said simply. "This is my home now, too." Her words hung in the air between them, soft but certain. Eli didn't answer right away. He just studied her face, the honesty there, and something in his chest shifted. He'd brought her here expecting a stranger who would fill a space, not someone who would change what that space meant. He finally nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll do it together." In the days that followed, the ranch began to stir back to life. The workers returned to their duties, and the smell of wood and earth replaced the stench of smoke. Clara spent her mornings cooking and her afternoons helping Eli carry timber, despite his protests. The two of them fell into a rhythm again, not the awkward, careful one from before, but something steady and familiar. Sometimes he'd hand her a nail and their fingers would brush, and she'd feel her pulse quicken. Other times, he'd catch her humming while she worked and smile without saying a word. The distance that had once separated them had vanished, replaced by a quiet ease that neither of them fully understood but both of them felt. One evening, when the sun was sinking low, Eli called out to her from the porch. "Clara," he said, his tone softer than she'd ever heard it. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "You remember what you said when you first got here?" She tilted her head. "I've said a lot of things." He smiled faintly. "You said no one marries a fat girl, sir, but I can cook." Her face flushed and she looked down, embarrassed. "I shouldn't have said that, it was foolish." "It wasn't foolish," he said, stepping closer. "It was honest." "But it wasn't true." Clara blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "What do you mean?" He stopped just in front of her. "You're not the woman those words describe. You're not someone to be pitied or laughed at. You're the one who kept this place running. You're the one who ran into a burning barn without a second thought. You're brave, you're kind, and you're beautiful." The word hit her like a rush of wind. Beautiful. No one had ever said it like that before, without pity, without mockery, without conditions. Her throat tightened. "Eli," he took her bandaged hands gently in his. "You changed this ranch, Clara. You changed me." The porch lantern flickered as the wind stirred, sending shadows dancing across his face. She could see the truth in his eyes, the kind that didn't need big words to prove itself. "I didn't mean to change anything," she whispered. He smiled. "That's how the best things happen." They stood there for a long time, the air between them thick with everything unspoken. The stars began to show, scattered like tiny lanterns across the night. Clara looked up, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. "You shouldn't say things you don't mean," she said softly. "I don't," he replied simply. "I've never meant anything more." Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't move. The years of rejection, the quiet ache of being unseen, all melted away under the weight of his words. She wanted to believe them. She wanted to hold on to them forever. Eli brushed his thumb over her hand, his voice barely a whisper. "You've spent too long trying to prove your worth, Clara, but you don't have to prove it to me." The night air was cool and the world seemed to pause. Clara looked up at him, her voice trembling. "You make it sound so simple," he chuckled softly. "Maybe it is." They stayed there until the last traces of light faded, neither speaking again. Somewhere in the distance, the crickets began their song and the ranch felt alive again, peaceful, complete. Later, when Clara went inside, she paused at the doorway and turned back. Eli was still standing on the porch, his hat tilted back, watching the stars. The soft glow from the lamp spilled over him, outlining the quiet strength in his frame. For the first time in her life, she didn't see herself through the cruel eyes of others. She saw herself through his, capable, strong, and deserving of love. She closed the door gently, the faint sound of the wind wrapping around the house like a promise. In that silence, Clara finally understood that the words that had haunted her, "No one marries a fat girl," had lost their power. And in their place, something far more powerful had taken root. The kind of love that doesn't ask you to change, only to stay.